The gunshot pierced the evening air just as Vivian Porter sealed the letter to her brother, her hands shaking as she pressed the wax stamp against the parchment. Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory, 1874, had once felt like sanctuary after her husband's death, but now it had become her prison. Through her window, she could see Mayor Harmon's men gathered at the saloon across the street, celebrating as if they'd already succeeded in forcing her into the marriage he'd announced would happen at month's end. Vivian tucked the letter into her apron pocket and wiped away tears with the back of her hand. 2 years a widow at 26, and now she was to be auctioned off like cattle to settle her late husband's debts she hadn't even known existed until Mayor Harmon produced the mysteriously appearing papers 3 weeks ago. "Madam." A soft knock at the back door of her modest dressmaking shop startled her. "Miss Porter, you in there?" Vivian's hand instinctively reached for the small derringer her husband Thomas had given her before he'd left for that final cattle drive. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Isaac Ironwood, madam. We met last spring when I brought in that torn shirt." Vivian remembered him tall, lean cowboy with eyes the color of Wyoming sky, quiet-spoken but direct. He'd paid fair for her work, and hadn't leered at her the way some of the men did when they discovered Fort Laramie had a young widow. She cracked open the door, keeping the derringer hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Mr. Ironwood, it's nearly 9 in the evening." "I know the hour's improper, madam." He stood in the shadows, hat in hand, a small pack slung over one shoulder. His eyes darted to the main street. "But I've heard what Harmon's planning for you, and I've come to offer a way out." Vivian studied his face in the dim light cast by her oil lamp. No trace of the whiskey flush that colored the cheeks of most men at this hour, no sign of deception in those clear eyes. Still, she kept her distance. "There is no way out, Mr. Ironwood. The mayor holds the notes on my husband's debts. He owns the bank, the sheriff, and half the town council." Isaac stepped slightly closer, his voice dropping. "What if you were already married, Mrs. Porter? What if you had a husband who'd been away working cattle drives but returned to claim what's his by law?" Her breath caught. "That would be a lie, sir." "It would be salvation," he countered. "I'm heading north to Montana Territory. My cousin has land there, good land, far from Harmon and his schemes. Come with me as my wife in name only, and once we're settled, you can decide your own path." A burst of raucous laughter from the saloon made them both tense. Mayor Harmon's booming voice carried through the night air. "Tomorrow we post the banns. The widow Porter will make me a fine fourth wife." Vivian's stomach turned. Harmon was 30 years her senior, with a reputation for breaking his wives' spirits before they mysteriously fell ill and died. His current wife, Beatrice, was confined to their home with a wasting disease that had started shortly after she'd questioned one of his business dealings. "Why would you help me?" Vivian asked, gripping her derringer tighter. "What do you gain?" Isaac's expression remained solemn. "My sister was forced into such a marriage back in Kansas. She didn't survive the year." A muscle worked in his jaw. "I swore I'd never stand by and watch it happen again if I could prevent it." For the first time in weeks, Vivian felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin. "How would we convince them?" she asked, already calculating what few possessions she could quickly gather. "We don't convince them of anything tonight," Isaac said. "We leave now while they're celebrating. By dawn, we'll be halfway to the Cheyenne River. Tomorrow at sundown, I ride back into town alone, announcing I've returned for my wife. They'll never believe it." Isaac's mouth curved slightly. "Your husband's name was Thomas Porter, originally from St. Louis. He had a small birthmark shaped like an arrowhead on his left shoulder. He called you Songbird when you were alone." Vivian gasped. How could you possibly know such things? Thomas and I rode together for 3 seasons. He was a good man who spoke often of his beautiful wife. When I heard your name in town last spring, I knew you were his widow, but I didn't speak of it because the grief was still so raw in your eyes. Isaac glanced toward the street again. He would want you safe, Vivian. He'd want you free. Tears blurred her vision. Thomas had mentioned an iron in his letters, a trusted friend whose real name he never wrote out fully. "Give me 10 minutes," she said, decision made. "I'll pack only what's necessary." Isaac nodded. "I'll ready the horses behind the livery. One small bag only, we need to travel light and fast." As he turned to go, Vivian caught his sleeve. "If I do this, Mr. Ironwood, if I trust you with my life, I need your word that this arrangement truly is in name only. I won't trade one cage for another." His eyes held hers, unwavering. "On my honor and Thomas's memory, you'll be as free with me as the Montana wind. The choice will always be yours." Vivian released his sleeve and stepped back into her shop. 10 minutes to abandon the life she had rebuilt from ashes. 10 minutes to either save herself or commit to the greatest mistake of her life. She began to pack. True to his word, Isaac was waiting with 2 horses when Vivian slipped through the shadows to the back of the livery stable. She had changed into her riding skirt and jacket, practical clothing she used when delivering orders to outlying farms. A small bag containing essential items was clutched in her trembling hands. "You came," he said simply, as if he'd half expected her to change her mind. "I had little choice," Vivian replied, allowing him to take her bag and secure it to the saddle of a chestnut mare. "Is this horse stolen?" Isaac shook his head. "Bought and paid for this morning. Been planning this since I overheard Harmon's announcement in the saloon 3 days ago." This surprised her. "You've been planning my escape for 3 days without speaking to me." "I've been arranging the means for your escape," he corrected, helping her mount. "The choice to leave was always going to be yours alone." They rode out of Fort Laramie under the cover of darkness, keeping to the less traveled paths that Isaac seemed to know by heart. The night was cool for early autumn, and Vivian was grateful for the woolen jacket she'd had the foresight to bring. Behind them, the lights of town gradually receded, and the vast Wyoming wilderness opened before them, illuminated only by a 3/4 moon and a blanket of stars. After they had ridden for nearly 2 hours, putting sufficient distance between themselves and Fort Laramie, Isaac led them to a small clearing near a creek. "We'll rest the horses here," he said, dismounting and offering a hand to help her down. Vivian's legs were stiff from the unaccustomed riding. She had not been on horseback since before Thomas died. "How far to this Montana territory of yours?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite her exhaustion and uncertainty. 10 days good riding, barring trouble," Isaac answered, unsaddling the horses and leading them to drink from the creek. "We'll stay off the main trails as much as possible. Harmon has connections throughout the territory." Vivian sank down onto a fallen log, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what she had done. She had abandoned her business, her home meager as it was, and cast her lot with a virtual stranger who claimed to have known her husband. "I have nothing but your word that you knew Thomas," she said as Isaac returned from tending the horses. "Nothing but your word that you aren't leading me into something worse than what I fled." Isaac knelt down a respectful distance from her, removing his hat. In the moonlight, his features were cast in sharp relief, the straight line of his nose, the determined set of his jaw, the weariness around his eyes that spoke of hard years on the trail. "Thomas kept a small silver pocket watch that played a tune when opened," Isaac said quietly. "Inside was a miniature portrait of you wearing a blue dress. He said it was what you wore on your wedding day because you believed blue brought good fortune. Vivian's breath caught. She had painted that tiny self-portrait as a wedding gift. No one in Fort Laramie had ever seen it. He also carried a letter from you everywhere he went, Isaac continued. One where you wrote about planting sunflowers outside your kitchen window because they always turned their faces to the light, just as you turned your heart toward him no matter the distance between you. Tears welled in Vivian's eyes. Those had been her exact words, written in a moment of poetic sentiment during their first separation after marriage. How did he die? She asked, the question that had haunted her for 2 years. The official report had been sparse: an accident during a storm while crossing the Platte River with the herd, but she had always sensed there was more to the story. Isaac's expression darkened. It wasn't an accident, Vivian. The night seemed to grow colder around her. What do you mean? Thomas discovered something he shouldn't have about one of the investors in that cattle drive, a man with powerful friends and a long reach. Harmon, Vivian whispered, the pieces suddenly falling into place. Isaac nodded grimly. Harmon had money in that venture, along with several other gentlemen from across the territory. They were using the cattle business to move more than beef. Thomas found evidence of it and confronted them, and they killed him for it. It wasn't a question. The knowledge settled into Vivian's heart like a stone. They made it look like he was caught in the river crossing, but I saw 2 men following him that night when he went to check on a section of the herd that had strayed. Isaac's hands clenched into fists. I found him at dawn. He was still alive, barely. Made me promise to get word to you to make sure you were safe. But you never came, Vivian said, an accusatory edge to her voice. For 2 years I heard nothing. Because I spent most of those 2 years in a prison camp near Santa Fe, Isaac replied without defensiveness. The same men who killed Thomas made sure I couldn't talk. By the time I got out and made my way north again, you'd established yourself in Fort Laramie. I watched from a distance, saw you were managing, until Harmon started closing his trap. Vivian absorbed this information, testing it against what she knew of her husband and the circumstances of his death. It had always seemed strange that Thomas, an experienced cattleman, would make such a fatal error during a river crossing. Why would Harmon want to marry me now? She asked. If he feared what Thomas might have told me. Because he's not certain what you know, Isaac cut in. And a wife can't testify against her husband in court. Marrying you isn't just about his usual appetites, it's insurance. Vivian stood suddenly, needing to move to process this horrifying revelation. Thomas never told me anything about illegal activities. He protected me from the details of his business. Harmon can't be certain of that, and now that his political ambitions are growing, he can't risk any loose ends. Isaac rose as well, keeping his distance, allowing her the space she needed. I'm sorry to tell you this way, Vivian. I know it's a lot to take in alongside everything else. She turned to face him, studying his features in the moonlight. If he was lying, he was the most consummate actor she had ever encountered. But her instincts told her he was speaking the truth, a truth that explained so many small inconsistencies in the official account of Thomas's death. What happens tomorrow? She asked, bringing her focus back to their immediate situation. When you ride into town claiming to be my husband. I create enough confusion and legal entanglement to buy us time, Isaac explained. Wyoming territory recognizes common law marriages. If I can convince enough people there was such an arrangement between us, it complicates Harmon's plans. While his men are busy trying to disprove my claim, we'll be heading north toward freedom. And if they catch us, Isaac's expression turned grave. They won't if we're careful, but if something happens to me, you continue north. I've written directions to my cousin's ranch and a letter explaining everything. He reached into his jacket and handed her a sealed envelope. "Keep this with you always." Vivian took the envelope, feeling the weight of responsibility it represented. "I still don't understand why you would risk so much for me." Isaac looked away, his gaze focusing on the distant horizon where the first faint lightening of pre-dawn was just becoming visible. "I told you about my sister. That was truth. But there's more." He hesitated. "Thomas saved my life more than once on the trail. We weren't just riding partners, we were like brothers. When he lay dying, I made him a promise that I'd see you safe if ever you needed it. I'm simply honoring that debt." There was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't sharing everything, but Vivian was too exhausted to press further. She tucked the envelope securely into her inner jacket pocket. "We should rest for a few hours," Isaac said, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "I'll set up a small camp. You can sleep while I keep watch, then we'll switch." Vivian nodded, suddenly aware of how bone-tired she was. As Isaac efficiently prepared a modest campsite, unrolling bedrolls on opposite sides of a small fire he skillfully built to produce minimal smoke, she found herself studying him more carefully. There was a quiet competence in his movements that spoke of years spent surviving in harsh conditions. His hands, though strong and calloused, handled each task with surprising gentleness. This was a man accustomed to hard living but not hardened by it, at least not completely. "Thank you," she said, as he handed her a cup of coffee brewed from supplies in his saddlebags. "Not just for this, but for coming back for me, even if it took 2 years." Isaac met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Get some rest, Vivian. Tomorrow will test us both." As she settled onto the bedroll, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of horse and leather and the open prairie, Vivian realized that, for the first time since learning of Thomas's death, she wasn't facing her troubles alone. Whether that was a blessing or simply a different kind of danger remained to be seen. The sun had fully risen by the time Isaac woke Vivian from her brief sleep. She startled at his gentle touch on her shoulder, momentarily disoriented before the events of the previous night came rushing back. "We need to keep moving," he said, already having packed most of their modest camp. "I want to put at least another 10 miles between us and Fort Laramie before I circle back." They ate a simple breakfast of jerky and hardtack washed down with more coffee, then mounted their horses and continued northwest, following game trails and natural passes that kept them hidden from the main routes. The Wyoming landscape stretched around them, rolling prairies giving way to rugged foothills, the distant mountains a blue-gray smudge on the horizon. Around midday, they reached a weathered-lined shack nestled in a stand of cottonwoods beside a small stream. It was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace and a sagging roof, but it offered shelter and concealment. This was used by the Bar Double D Ranch for their line riders, Isaac explained as they dismounted. "Been abandoned since they sold out to Harmon's syndicate last year. No one comes here anymore." "This is where we part ways?" Vivian asked, unable to keep a note of apprehension from her voice despite her determination to be brave. Isaac nodded, securing the horses in a crude corral attached to the shack. "You'll be safe here until I return. There's a cellar beneath the floorboards with emergency supplies. If I'm not back by dawn tomorrow, you take the mare and these maps and continue north." He handed her several folded papers from his saddlebag. "Follow these exactly. My cousin will be expecting you. And if you are caught—" The possibility hung between them, unpleasant but necessary to acknowledge. "I won't say anything to endanger you," Isaac assured her, his voice firm. "As far as anyone in Fort Laramie will know, my wife is waiting for me at a homestead near the Montana border." Vivian watched as he checked his revolver and secured extra ammunition in his belt. What exactly do you plan to do when you reach town? First, I'll visit the land office and register a homestead claim in both our names that creates an official record of our supposed marriage. He continued checking his gear as he spoke. Then I'll make sure I'm seen and heard in the saloon, talking about coming back for my wife after working cattle in Texas. With the right audience, word will spread quickly. Harmon will challenge you immediately. I'm counting on it. The more publicly he does so, the more witnesses we'll have to my claim. Isaac looked up at her, his expression serious. The key is creating enough legal confusion that he can't simply force you into marriage while the matter is being resolved. By the time it would reach a territorial judge, we'll be in Montana. The plan had merit, Vivian had to admit, though it relied heavily on Isaac's abilities to convince and delay. Be careful, she said simply. Harmon doesn't fight fair. Neither do I when necessary. Something cold and determined flashed in Isaac's eyes, a reminder that beneath his quiet demeanor was a man who had survived prison camps and the brutal realities of the frontier. He reached into his saddlebag one more time and pulled out a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Take this. Keep it with you. Vivian unwrapped the cloth to find a Colt Navy revolver, smaller than his own but well maintained. I have my Derringer, she said. That pea-shooter is fine for close range, but this gives you 6 shots and better distance. Isaac checked that the weapon was loaded but with the hammer resting on an empty chamber for safety. You know how to use it, Thomas taught me, Vivian replied, remembering the hours her husband had spent patiently instructing her at targets set up behind their first small homestead. She had been a reluctant student then, never imagining she would need such skills. Now she was grateful for his insistence. Isaac seemed satisfied with her answer. I'll be back by nightfall tomorrow. If I'm not, I follow the maps north, she finished for him. I remember. He nodded, then hesitated before reaching into his shirt pocket. One more thing, if anyone questions you, you should have this. He extended his hand, revealing a simple gold band. It was my mother's, if you're comfortable wearing it. Vivian stared at the ring, understanding its purpose in maintaining their charade. Still, something about placing another woman's wedding band on her finger felt like a betrayal of Thomas's memory. Isaac sensed her hesitation. You don't have to. I just thought, no, you're right, she interrupted, taking the ring from his palm. It makes sense for our story. She slipped it onto her finger where it fit almost perfectly. The metal felt strange against her skin. She had removed her own wedding band a year after Thomas's death, unable to bear the constant reminder of all she had lost. Isaac watched her with an unreadable expression, then turned away to make final preparations for his journey back to Fort Laramie. As he mounted his horse, he looked down at Vivian with an intensity that caught her off guard. Bolt the door behind me, he instructed. Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more so you'll know it's safe. Vivian nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him go despite having known him less than a day. He represented her only ally in a suddenly hostile world. Isaac, she called as he turned his horse toward the trail. Why did Thomas call you Iron? A faint smile touched his lips. He said, I was stubborn as iron once I made up my mind about something. The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. Lock the door, Vivian. She watched until he disappeared into the trees, then followed his instructions, securing the heavy wooden bar across the door and checking that the single small window was similarly barricaded. Alone in the shadowy interior of the line shack, Vivian took stock of her surroundings. The cabin was sparse but not squalid. Someone had taken care to keep it functional. The roof, while old, didn't appear to leak. The stone fireplace was clean of debris. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in one corner near a small cast-iron stove. A narrow cot with a straw-filled mattress occupied the opposite wall. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. Vivian found the trapdoor to the cellar exactly where Isaac had indicated, beneath a frayed rug near the stove. Below, as promised, were emergency supplies. Jerky, beans, coffee, ammunition, candles, matches, and several bottles of whiskey that she suspected were valued as much for medicinal purposes as for drinking. After bringing up what she needed for a simple meal, Vivian settled in for the long wait. The hours stretched before her, empty and anxious. To occupy her hands and calm her thoughts, she withdrew a small sewing kit from her bag and began mending a tear in one of her blouses. As the needle dipped and rose through the fabric, her mind returned to the revelations about Thomas's death. If what Isaac said was true, and increasingly she believed it was, then her husband had been murdered for his integrity. There was bitter irony in the fact that the man responsible was now attempting to force her into marriage. Night fell, bringing a deeper silence to the cabin, broken only by the occasional call of a distant coyote or the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush outside. Vivian kept a single candle burning, unwilling to risk a fire that might be spotted. She wrapped herself in a blanket against the autumn chill and sat with her back to the wall, the Navy revolver within easy reach. Sleep came in fitful bursts, disturbed by dreams of pursuit and flashes of Thomas's face, now blurring in her memory despite her efforts to hold his features clear. In the darkest hours before dawn, she woke fully, heart pounding, certain she had heard something outside. Minutes passed as she listened intently, the revolver now gripped in her hand. Finally, the sound came again, the snap of a twig, too heavy to be a small animal. Someone was moving around the cabin. Vivian rose silently, pressing herself against the wall beside the door, out of sight should anyone peer through the cracks in the weathered wood. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, methodically, stopping occasionally as if listening or examining something. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, her breathing shallow and controlled. Had Harmon's men already tracked them? Was Isaac captured, forced to reveal her location? A voice came from just outside the door, so close she nearly fired in startled reaction. "Mrs. Porter, are you in there?" "It's Deputy Marshal Ellis from Fort Laramie." Vivian remained silent, recognizing the name but not the voice. Ellis was new to the area, having arrived only months ago to replace the previous deputy who had mysteriously disappeared after disagreeing with Harmon over a land dispute. "Mrs. Porter, if you're inside, please respond. I've been sent to escort you safely back to town." Still, she made no sound. Isaac's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't open for anyone but me." "We know you're traveling with Isaac Ironwood," the voice continued, an edge of impatience now evident. "He's been detained in Fort Laramie on suspicion of kidnapping and theft. If you come peacefully now, the charges might be reduced." Her heart sank at the news that Isaac had been captured, but something about the deputy's approach felt wrong. If they truly believed she had been kidnapped, they would be more concerned for her welfare, less focused on securing her compliance. "I have men positioned in the trees," the voice warned. "We can wait you out or we can do this the hard way. Your choice, Mrs. Porter." The threat confirmed her suspicions. This was no rescue party. Harmon must have sent his men after them almost immediately, perhaps even having them follow at a distance while Isaac thought they were creating a lead. Vivian weighed her options. The cabin offered some protection, but she was outnumbered and would eventually need to leave for water and supplies. If they truly had the place surrounded, escape would be nearly impossible. Unless the cellar. She recalled seeing a small air shaft in one corner that might lead to the outside. It would be tight, perhaps too narrow for a man, but she might be able to squeeze through. Moving silently, Vivian gathered her essential items, the maps, the revolver, her small bag of personal belongings, and eased the trapdoor open, wincing at the faint creak of its hinges. She lowered herself into the darkness below, pulling the door closed above her. The cellar was cool and damp, the earthen walls reinforced with rough timbers. Using a match to light one of the candles stored there, Vivian located the air shaft, little more than a narrow tunnel reinforced with stones leading upward at an angle. She blew out the candle and listened. Above, she could hear the deputy still calling for her, his patience clearly wearing thin. Then came the sound of something heavy striking the door they were breaking in. With no time to waste, Vivian pushed her bag into the shaft and began to wriggle after it, the confined space scraping her shoulders and tearing at her clothing. The tunnel was longer than she had estimated, and halfway through, she feared she might become stuck, trapped as the men discovered her escape route. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Vivian forced herself to breathe slowly, to focus on moving forward inch by painful inch. Above, she heard the crash of the door giving way, followed by angry shouts as the intruders discovered the cabin empty. Finally, her hands broke through into open air, emerging from an opening partially hidden by a fallen log and overgrown with brush about 50 yards from the cabin. She pulled herself free, staying low as she retrieved her bag and oriented herself using the position of the rising sun. North. She needed to go north, following the maps Isaac had given her. If he had been captured, her only hope was to reach his cousin's ranch in Montana Territory before Harmon's men caught up with her. But first, she needed a horse. Crouching in the underbrush, Vivian assessed the situation. She could see 4 horses hitched to trees near the cabin, the mounts of the men who had come for her. Her own mare was still in the corral, now visible as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. The men were inside the cabin, their voices raised in argument as they searched for her. It was now or never. Staying low and using the trees for cover, Vivian made her way to the corral. The mare nickered softly in recognition as she approached, and Vivian froze, fearing the sound would alert the men. But their angry voices continued uninterrupted, and she resumed her cautious advance. With trembling hands, she opened the corral gate and led the mare out, not daring to mount until they were further from the cabin. They had gone perhaps 100 yards when a shout went up behind them. She had been spotted. Vivian swung onto the mare's back and kicked her into a gallop, heading northeast through the trees as gunshots rang out behind her. She bent low over the horse's neck, making herself as small a target as possible as they crashed through the underbrush. A bullet splintered bark from a tree inches from her head, and another tore through the sleeve of her jacket without touching flesh. Then they were beyond effective range, the mare's powerful stride carrying them swiftly away from their pursuers. But Vivian knew this was only the beginning of what promised to be a desperate race north. With Isaac captured, she was truly alone, a woman fleeing across unfamiliar territory with enemies at her back and an uncertain sanctuary ahead. As the mare settled into a steady rhythm, putting distance between them and the cabin, Vivian allowed herself a moment of grief for Isaac. He had risked everything to help her, honoring a promise to a dead friend, and had paid the price for his loyalty. If when she reached safety, she silently vowed to find a way to free him. It was the least she could do for the man who had become her unlikely champion. The rising sun gilded the eastern horizon as Vivian pushed her mare northward, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading behind her. But she had no illusions about her safety. Harmon's men would follow, and they knew these lands far better than she did. Her only advantages were determination and the detailed maps. Isaac had provided maps that showed not only the main trails, but also hidden routes and emergency shelters known primarily to those who had worked the cattle drives through these territories. By midday, with no signs of immediate pursuit, Vivian allowed the mare a brief rest beside a small stream. As the horse drank, she studied the maps again, tracing the route Isaac had marked in red ink. They had made good progress, but the most challenging terrain still lay ahead, a region of steep ravines and narrow passes where ambush would be easy for anyone who knew she was coming. She was refolding the maps when a flash of metal in the stream caught her eye. Leaning closer, she discovered a gold pocket watch half buried in the silty bottom. With trembling fingers, she retrieved it, her heart pounding as she recognized the intricate engraving on its cover. It was Thomas's watch, the one Isaac had described with the miniature portrait inside. Vivian pried open the case, and there she was, painted in the blue dress she had worn on their wedding day. The tiny clockwork still functioned, playing a few notes of the lullaby Thomas had often hummed to her in the evenings. But what was the watch doing here, in this stream so far from where Thomas had died? Had Isaac dropped it during their flight from Fort Laramie? Or was there another explanation, one that sent a chill down her spine despite the warmth of the autumn sun? She closed the watch and tucked it securely into her inner pocket alongside the letter Isaac had given her. Questions would have to wait. Survival came first. Mounting the mare again, Vivian continued north, keeping to the sheltering trees where possible and moving with greater caution as the terrain became more rugged. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered in the west, promising rain before nightfall. She needed to find shelter. According to Isaac's map, there should be another line shack about 5 miles ahead, this one used by the old Broken Arrow outfit before they too had been absorbed into Harmon's growing empire. If she pushed on, she could reach it before the storm broke. The first raindrops were starting to fall as Vivian crested a ridge and spotted the weathered structure below, nestled against a rocky outcropping that would provide additional protection from the elements. She urged the tired mare forward, eager for the relative safety of walls and a roof. As they approached the shack, however, something made her rein in sharply, smoke the faintest wisp rising from the crude chimney. Someone was already there. Vivian considered her options. The approaching storm made continuing on dangerous, but the occupied cabin represented an unknown threat. She had no way of knowing if the current occupant was friend or foe. Decision made, she dismounted and led the mare to a sheltered hollow about 100 yards from the cabin. Securing the horse, she drew the Navy revolver and moved carefully forward, using the gathering dusk and increasing rain for concealment. Through a small, grimy window, she could see a single figure moving inside a man, tall and lean, tending a modest fire in the stone fireplace. His back was to her, but there was something familiar in the set of his shoulders, the careful economy of his movements. When he turned to reach for something on a crude shelf, firelight illuminated his profile and Vivian nearly cried out in shock. Isaac Ironwood. For a moment, she doubted her own eyes. Hadn't the deputy said Isaac was detained in Fort Laramie? Yet here he was, apparently free and unharmed, calmly preparing what looked like a simple meal. Confusion and suspicion warred within her. If Isaac had escaped custody, why hadn't he returned for her as promised? If he had never been captured at all, what game was he playing? And most troubling, how had Thomas's watch ended up in a stream along their escape route? Vivian's grip tightened on the revolver as she circled to the cabin door. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was direct confrontation. Drawing a deep breath, she raised her hand and knocked 3 times, pause, twice more the signal Isaac himself had established. The sounds from within ceased immediately. After a moment of silence, footsteps approached the door. "Who's there?" Isaac's voice cautious and tight. "Your wife," Vivian replied with deliberate irony, the revolver raised and ready. A beat of silence, then the sound of a heavy bar being lifted. The door opened just enough for her to see Isaac's face, his expression cycling rapidly from shock to relief to wariness as he registered the weapon aimed at his chest. "Vivian," he breathed. "How did you?" His gaze flicked past her to the rain-soaked darkness beyond. "Are you alone? Were you followed?" "I believe I'm the one who should be asking questions," she said firmly, not lowering the revolver. "The deputy said you'd been captured." Understanding dawned in Isaac's eyes. "They found the line shack. I was afraid of that." He opened the door wider, stepping back to allow her entry but keeping his hands where she could see them. "I wasn't captured, Vivian. I never even made it to Fort Laramie." She entered cautiously, keeping the weapon trained on him as she used her foot to push the door closed behind her. The small cabin was warm from the fire, the scent of coffee and something savory filling the air. "Explain," she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. Isaac remained still, respecting the threat of the revolver. "I was about 5 miles from town when I encountered a man I recognized, one of the hands from the bar Double D who used to ride with Harmon's enforcers. He was headed out with 3 others, and I had a hunch they were looking for you. So you turned back without warning me." "I couldn't risk leading them straight to you," Isaac countered. "I circled wide, planning to head them off and feed them false information, but they split up, and I could only follow one group. By the time I realized the others must have found your trail, it was too late to reach you first." Vivian considered this, weighing it against her instinctive distrust. "How did you know I'd come this way?" "I didn't for certain. I was heading back to check the line shack when the storm started building. This was the nearest shelter on the route north." He gestured to a small map spread on the rough table. "I was plotting alternate routes, hoping to intercept you before you reached the more difficult terrain ahead." It was a plausible explanation, consistent with what she knew of him so far, but something still bothered her. "What about this?" She withdrew the pocket watch with one hand, keeping the revolver steady with the other. Isaac's expression shifted to one of genuine surprise. "Where did you find that?" "In a stream about 15 miles back. Strange place for a treasured keepsake to end up, wouldn't you say?" She watched him closely for any sign of deception. Isaac's brow furrowed. "I don't understand. That watch was stolen from me in the prison camp. I never got it back." His eyes met hers, troubled and confused. "Vivian, if you found it along our escape route, someone must have planted it there for you to find. Or you dropped it while fleeing the cabin," she suggested, still suspicious. "I haven't had that watch in nearly 2 years, Isaac insisted. "Think about it. Why would I leave behind something that proves my connection to Thomas if I were trying to deceive you?" The logic of this struck her. It would indeed be a foolish mistake for someone playing a long con. But if Isaac hadn't dropped the watch, who had placed it for her to find? And why? A crack of thunder shook the small cabin, the storm now directly overhead. Rain lashed against the single window, driven by gusting winds that found every gap in the aging structure. "You should sit," Isaac said, nodding toward the cabin's only chair. "You look exhausted, and that mare of yours has probably carried you hard all day." "The horse," Vivian remembered suddenly. "She's sheltered in a hollow down the ridge. I should bring her in." "I'll go," Isaac offered, reaching slowly for his oilskin coat hanging near the door. "No," Vivian said sharply, not ready to let him out of her sight. "We'll both go." They retrieved the mare together, leading her to a lean-to attached to the cabin that provided adequate shelter from the storm. Working side by side to rub the horse down and ensure she had feed and water, Vivian found herself studying Isaac more closely, searching for any sign that might confirm or disprove her lingering suspicions. He worked with the same quiet competence she had noted before, his hands gentle with the tired animal. Once, when their fingers accidentally brushed as they both reached for the same blanket, she felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with suspicion and everything to do with his proximity in the confined space. Back inside the cabin, Isaac served the simple meal he had prepared: beans, salt pork, and corn bread, with strong black coffee to wash it down. Vivian's hunger finally overcame her caution, and she ate gratefully while keeping the revolver on the table beside her plate. "You should know," Isaac said as they finished eating, "that Harmon will have men watching all the main routes north. Even with the maps, getting to Montana won't be easy." "What do you suggest?" Vivian asked, willing now to at least consider his counsel. Isaac spread the map between them, pointing to a series of marks in red ink. "These are known patrol points for Harmon's men. We need to avoid them, which means taking the harder trails through the high country." His finger traced a winding route. "It adds 3 days to the journey, but decreases our chances of being spotted." 3 more days of running," Vivian murmured, the weight of their situation settling over her again. 3 more days of staying alive," Isaac corrected gently. "Once we cross into Montana territory, Harmon's influence wanes. My cousin's ranch is here." He indicated a spot near the Tongue River. "Martin Ironwood. He was a Union officer during the war, still has connections with the territorial authorities. You'll be safe there while we sort out this mess legally." Vivian studied the map, noting the distance they still had to cover. "And if we're caught before we reach Montana," Isaac's expression hardened, "we won't be. I didn't spend 2 years in that prison camp just to fail now." The intensity in his voice drew her gaze up from the map to his face. In the flickering firelight, she could see the determination etched in every line of his features, along with something deeper, something he had yet to fully explain. "Why did they imprison you, Isaac? The real reason?" He was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper against the background of rain and thunder. "They wanted to know what Thomas told me before he died. They were certain he had passed on evidence of their operation: names, dates, locations. And had he?" Isaac's gaze returned to hers, steady and unflinching. "Yes." The simple affirmation hung between them, pregnant with implications. "What kind of evidence?" Vivian pressed, sensing they were approaching the heart of a mystery that had shadowed her life for years. "Thomas kept a journal," Isaac explained. "Details of cattle shipments that didn't match the official records, meetings with men who had no business connection to the drives, money changing hands for services never rendered. He was building a case against a network that stretched from Wyoming all the way to Texas and Mexico." "Where is this journal now?" A ghost of a smile touched Isaac's lips. "That's what they wanted to know in Santa Fe, what they tried to beat out of me for months." Vivian leaned forward, her earlier suspicions forgotten in the face of this revelation. "And what did you tell them?" "Nothing," Isaac said simply. "Because Thomas never told me where he hid it. He only said it was somewhere safe, somewhere they would never think to look." The implications washed over Vivian in a cold wave of understanding. "They think I have it. That's why Harmon wants to marry me, not just to prevent me from testifying, but to search our home, to have unlimited access to everything Thomas might have left behind." Isaac nodded grimly. "That's my belief. And when they find nothing, well." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Vivian rose from her chair and paced the small confines of the cabin, her mind racing. "But I don't have any journal. Thomas never mentioned anything like that to me." "Are you certain?" Isaac watched her carefully. "Did he send you anything unusual before he died? Letters, packages, seemingly ordinary items that might have special significance?" She shook her head, frustrated. "Nothing I can think of. Just his regular letters, a small package of fabric for a dress he wanted me to make for our anniversary." She trailed off, a memory stirring. "And a book of poetry, Whitman. He knew I enjoyed it, but it seemed an odd gift at the time because we already had a copy at home." Isaac sat up straighter. "When did this arrive?" "About a week before the news of his death." Vivian closed her eyes, trying to recall details. "It came with a letter saying he missed hearing me read aloud in the evenings." "Do you still have it? The book?" "Yes, it's in my trunk back in Fort Laramie. I couldn't bear to part with it after he died." A new thought struck her. "You don't think it's worth investigating?" Isaac said, clearly trying to contain his excitement. Thomas was clever. He wouldn't have hidden evidence where it would be easily found, but he would want it somewhere you had access to. Vivian sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. If the journal was indeed hidden within or disguised as the book of poetry, it had been sitting in her possession all this time, potentially containing the evidence needed to bring Harmon and his associates to justice. "We have to go back," she said suddenly, the decision crystallizing in her mind. "Back to Fort Laramie." Isaac stared at her as if she had suggested jumping off a cliff. "That's suicide, Vivian. Harmon's men will be watching your shop. The minute we appear, not openly," she interrupted. "There's a cellar access from the alley behind my shop. Only Thomas and I knew about it. It's where we stored extra fabrics and supplies during the winter." "Even so, the risk is necessary," Vivian finished firmly. "If that book contains what we think it might, it's our only real chance at freedom. Otherwise, we'll be running for the rest of our lives." Isaac studied her for a long moment, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're as stubborn as Thomas always said," he finally remarked. "But you're right. Evidence is the only thing that will truly end this." Outside, the storm raged on, mirroring the tumult of Vivian's thoughts. They had a new plan now, not flight but return, not escape but confrontation. It was terrifying and empowering all at once. "We'll leave at first light," Isaac decided, rising to add more wood to the fire. "Head south using the less traveled routes. If we're careful, we can reach Fort Laramie in 2 days without being spotted." Vivian nodded, already mentally preparing for what lay ahead. As Isaac moved about the cabin, securing it against the storm, she found herself watching him with new eyes. The suspicion that had colored her perception earlier was fading, replaced by something more complex: trust born of shared danger and common purpose. "You should take the cot," Isaac said, interrupting her thoughts. "I'll keep watch from the chair." "We both need rest," Vivian countered. "And you've been riding all day as well. We can take turns." Isaac looked as if he might argue, then simply nodded in acceptance. "I'll take first watch." "Wake you in 4 hours." As Vivian settled onto the narrow cot, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke and horses, she realized she had made her choice. She had decided to trust Isaac Ironwood, a man she barely knew but to whom she had already entrusted her life. Whether that trust was misplaced remained to be seen. But as she drifted toward sleep, lulled by the rhythm of the rain and the comforting presence of another human being in this wilderness, Vivian felt something she had not experienced in 2 long years: hope. True to his word, Isaac woke Vivian 4 hours later to take her turn at watch. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence broken only by the occasional drip of water from the eaves. Through the cabin's single window, she could see stars emerging from between scattered clouds, their light casting silver patterns across the damp earth. Isaac slept soundly on the cot, his features relaxed in repose, looking younger than his waking self. Vivian found herself wondering about his life before Thomas, before the prison camp that had clearly left both physical and emotional scars. His hands, even in sleep, bore the marks of hard-living calluses from reins and ropes, small nicks and scars that told stories he had yet to share. The night passed without incident, and they departed at first light as planned, heading south by southwest along game trails and abandoned logging roads. They rode single file, Isaac leading, Vivian following close behind, both alert for any sign of pursuit or ambush. By midday, they had covered nearly 20 miles, pushing their mounts as hard as they dared while still maintaining the animals' stamina for the journey ahead. During a brief stop to rest the horses, Isaac shared dried beef and hardtack from his saddlebags. "Once we reach the outskirts of Fort Laramie," he explained between bites, "we'll need to separate. I'll create a diversion to draw attention away from your shop while you retrieve the book." "What kind of diversion?" Vivian asked, concerned by the determined set of his jaw. "The kind that ensures all eyes are elsewhere," he replied vaguely. "Don't worry about me. Just get in and out as quickly as possible. We'll meet at the old Millerson place 3 miles east of town." "The abandoned homestead by the creek," Isaac nodded. "It's still standing, and most folks avoid it since the Millerson boy was found dead there last year. They say it's haunted." A faint smile touched his lips. "Superstition works in our favor sometimes." They continued south throughout the afternoon, the terrain gradually shifting from rugged hills to the more open country surrounding Fort Laramie. As dusk approached, they made camp in a dense copse of cottonwoods beside a small tributary of the Laramie River. While Isaac tended the horses, Vivian gathered wood for a small, carefully banked fire that would provide warmth without creating telltale smoke. The evening air carried a sharper chill than previous nights, a reminder that winter would soon be closing in on the high plains. "We should reach town by midday tomorrow," Isaac said as they ate a sparse supper of the last of their provisions. "If all goes well, we can be on our way north again before nightfall." "And if all doesn't go well?" Vivian couldn't help asking. Isaac met her gaze steadily across the low flames. "Then we improvise." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small leather pouch. "I want you to take this, just in case we're separated." Vivian accepted the pouch, surprised by its weight. Inside, she found a substantial amount of gold coins, far more money than she had seen since before Thomas died. "Isaac, I can't." "You can and you will," he cut her off firmly. "It's not charity, Vivian. It's insurance. If something happens to me, that's enough to get you safely to Montana and establish yourself there." She wanted to protest further but recognized the practicality of his precaution. "Thank you," she said instead, securing the pouch within her jacket. Isaac nodded once, then turned the conversation to their plans for the next day, laying out contingencies and rendezvous points with the thoroughness of a military campaign. As he spoke, Vivian found herself studying the planes of his face in the flickering light, the straight nose, the firm set of his mouth, the tiny scar at the corner of his left eye that whitened when he frowned in concentration. She had initially seen him only as Thomas's friend, a convenient ally in her time of need. But over these past few days, Isaac Ironwood had revealed himself to be far more complex than she had imagined. Loyal to a fault, intelligent, resourceful, and possessed of a quiet strength that complemented her own determination. When had her perception of him begun to shift? Was it during their frantic escape from the line shack, their reunion during the storm, or perhaps it was happening even now as he meticulously planned for her safety with no apparent thought for his own? "Vivian," Isaac's voice broke into her thoughts. "Did you hear what I said about the signal?" She blinked, embarrassed to have been caught wool-gathering. "I'm sorry, no. My mind wandered." He repeated the details of the signal they would use to identify themselves at their meeting point, a pattern of owl calls that would be unremarkable in the wilderness, but recognizable to each other. As they banked the fire for the night and prepared to sleep, taking turns as before, Vivian found herself reluctant to close her eyes, aware that tomorrow might change everything. Either they would secure the evidence needed to bring down Harmon and his associates, or they would be caught in the attempt. There seemed to be no middle ground, no safe retreat. "Isaac," she said softly as he was spreading his bedroll, "if we succeed tomorrow, if we find Thomas's journal, and it contains what you believe, what happens next?" He paused, considering her question carefully. "We take it to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. He's a fair man from what I've heard, not in Harmon's pocket. With solid evidence, he could bring federal charges that even Harmon's connections couldn't dismiss. And after that," the question slipped out before she could stop it, revealing more of her uncertainty than she had intended. Isaac's gaze met hers, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "That would depend on what you want, Vivian." The simplicity of his answer took her by surprise. Throughout this ordeal, she had been so focused on survival, on escape, that she had given little thought to what might come after. What did she want, beyond mere safety? "I don't know," she admitted. "For so long, just getting through each day was enough." Isaac nodded in understanding. "When Thomas died, I felt the same, like the future had contracted to just the next breath, the next step." He settled onto his bedroll, gaze turning upward to the stars visible through the canopy of leaves. "It takes time to start planning again, to believe in possibilities." "Do you?" she asked. "Believe in possibilities, I mean." A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the soft sounds of the night forest. "I'm beginning to," he finally answered, his voice so low she almost didn't catch the words. Vivian pondered this as she took her turn at watch, wondering what possibilities Isaac might be considering, and why the thought of him having plans that might not include her left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. Dawn broke clear and cold, the grass silvered with frost that crunched beneath their boots as they broke camp. They spoke little as they saddled the horses and set out on the final leg of their journey to Fort Laramie, each lost in private thoughts about what the day might bring. The land grew more familiar to Vivian as they approached the outskirts of town, rolling prairie giving way to scattered homesteads, then the more densely settled areas surrounding the fort itself. They kept to the wooded areas along the river whenever possible, avoiding the main roads where they might be spotted. By mid-morning, they had reached a ridge overlooking Fort Laramie from the northwest. From this vantage point, they could see the town spread below them, the military buildings of the actual fort, the commercial district where Vivian's dressmaking shop was located, and the grand house on the hill that belonged to Mayor Harmon. "Everything looks normal," Isaac observed, surveying the scene through a small spyglass. "Regular traffic in the streets, no unusual gatherings." "That could work in our favor," Vivian replied. "If they believe we've fled north, they may not be watching my shop as closely." Isaac lowered the spyglass, his expression grave. "Don't underestimate Harmon. He's thorough if nothing else. There will be someone watching, even if not obviously." They retreated from the ridge to finalize their plan in the safety of a small ravine, concealed from any observers by dense underbrush. "I'll enter town from the east," Isaac explained. "Make sure I'm seen near the saloon." "Given what the deputy told you at the line shack, Harmon's men will be surprised to see me free and in town. That should create enough confusion to buy you time. And I'll circle around to approach my shop from the back alley," Vivian confirmed. "The cellar entrance is hidden behind a stack of empty crates. Once inside, I should be able to locate the book quickly. It will be in my trunk with Thomas's other personal effects." Isaac checked his pocket watch. "It's just past 10 now. I'll create the diversion at 11:30. That should give you time to get into position. Be at the Millerson place by 1 at the latest." Vivian nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. The plan was simple in theory, but fraught with potential complications in execution. "If something goes wrong," Isaac continued, "if you're discovered or can't reach the meeting point, head northeast toward the Black Hills. There's an old trapper's cabin marked on your map where you can shelter until I find you. And if you're the one who runs into trouble?" Vivian asked, unwilling to consider the possibility but knowing she must. Isaac's expression softened slightly. "Then you continue to Montana alone. Martin will help you even if I'm not with you. I've written him about our situation." The implication that he had been planning for his own capture or death sent a chill through Vivian that had nothing to do with the morning air. She wanted to protest, to insist they find another way, but she knew there was no safer alternative. The evidence had to be recovered if they were ever to truly be free. "Be careful, Isaac," she said instead, the words inadequate to express the tangle of emotions she was feeling. "You too," he replied simply. Then, in a gesture that caught her completely by surprise, he reached out and briefly squeezed her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her cold ones. Before she could respond, he was mounting his horse, preparing to circle east toward town. Vivian watched him go, wondering why that simple touch had affected her more profoundly than any words could have. Pushing such thoughts aside, she checked her revolver one last time, secured her small bag, and mounted her mare. She had a book to find and precious little time to do it. Approaching Fort Laramie from the west, keeping to the tree line along the river, Vivian could see the back of her shop from a distance. The small building stood as she had left it days ago, its weathered clapboards and pitched roof unchanged. No horses were tied at the hitching post out front, and no obvious watchers were visible in the immediate vicinity. Still, she waited patiently in the shelter of a stand of cottonwoods, observing for nearly half an hour before making her move. In that time, she saw only the normal activity of a small frontier town, women hanging laundry in adjacent yards, a delivery boy making his rounds, the occasional rider passing through on business. At precisely 11:15, Vivian guided her mare along the bank of a small creek that ran behind the row of buildings housing her shop. She dismounted in a secluded spot and secured the horse where it would be hidden from casual observation, but easily accessible for a quick departure. Moving cautiously from shadow to shadow, she made her way to the back alley, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might be heard. The stack of crates concealing the cellar entrance was exactly as she had left it, undisturbed by any searchers who might have investigated the shop in her absence. Vivian glanced at her pocket watch. 11:27. In 3 minutes, Isaac would create his diversion. She positioned herself beside the crates, prepared to move quickly when the moment came. Right on schedule, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main street. Shouts, the pounding of running feet, then a gunshot followed by more yelling. Whatever Isaac had done, it was certainly drawing attention. Using the distraction, Vivian swiftly moved the crates aside, revealing the small wooden door set into the foundation of her shop. The key was where she always kept it, inside a hollow brick nearby. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the door and slipped inside, pulling it closed behind her. The cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and the fabrics she stored there. Vivian felt her way to the stairs leading up to the shop proper, familiar enough with the space to navigate without light. At the top of the stairs, she eased open the trapdoor, listening intently for any sound that might indicate someone was in the shop. Silence greeted her. Emboldened, she emerged into the main room of her dressmaking business, momentarily disoriented by the filtered sunlight after the darkness of the cellar. Everything was as she had left it, bolts of fabric neatly arranged on shelves, her sewing table with a half-finished dress still draped across it, the small counter where she conducted business with customers. The only sign of disturbance was a thin layer of dust that had settled in her absence. Vivian moved quickly to the curtained doorway leading to her living quarters at the back of the shop. Here, too, everything appeared untouched: her narrow bed with its patchwork quilt, the small table and single chair where she took her meals, the washstand with its porcelain basin and pitcher. And there, at the foot of the bed, was her trunk. She knelt before it, inserting the key she wore on a chain around her neck. The lock opened with a familiar click, and she raised the lid to reveal her most treasured possessions: her mother's silver hairbrush, the christening gown she had hoped to use for a child, Thomas's letters tied with a faded ribbon, and the book of poetry. Vivian lifted it reverently, running her fingers over the worn leather binding. It looked exactly as she remembered: an ordinary edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, its pages slightly yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, leafing through to see if anything unusual was hidden within. At first glance, it appeared to be just what it claimed: a book of poetry, nothing more. Had she been wrong? Was there no hidden journal after all? Then she noticed something odd about the binding. The inside cover seemed thicker than it should be, with a slight gap at one edge. Heart racing, Vivian examined it more closely and discovered that the original end paper had been carefully removed and replaced with a false one, creating a hidden compartment. Using her small sewing scissors, she gently pried at the edge until she could lift the false panel. Beneath it, pressed flat against the cover, was a sheaf of papers covered in Thomas's distinctive handwriting. She had found it. A quick glance confirmed that these were indeed the records Isaac had described: dates, names, amounts, locations, all meticulously documented in Thomas's neat hand. There were references to cattle shipments that never existed, payments for special cargo that had nothing to do with livestock, and names of prominent men throughout the territory, including Mayor Harmon. It was everything they needed to bring down Harmon's operation. Thomas had left the evidence where only she would find it, trusting that someday it would be used to bring justice to those who had corrupted the territory. Vivian carefully refolded the papers and tucked them securely inside her jacket. She was replacing the book in the trunk when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of the shop's front door opening. She froze, listening intently as footsteps moved across the wooden floor of the outer room. Heavy boots, a man's tread, approaching the curtained doorway to her living quarters. There was no time to return to the cellar. Vivian pressed herself against the wall beside the doorway, drawing her revolver as silently as possible. If she could surprise the intruder, she might have a chance to escape through the window overlooking the back alley. The footsteps stopped just outside the curtain. Then a voice called softly, "Vivian, are you in there?" Relief washed over her as she recognized Isaac's voice. "Yes," she replied, lowering the revolver and stepping into view as he pushed the curtain aside. He looked disheveled, his hat missing and a smear of blood on his shirt sleeve, but his eyes lit up at the sight of her. "Did you find it?" Vivian patted her jacket where the papers were hidden. "Yes, Thomas hid it exactly as you thought in the book." Isaac's face broke into a rare smile. "I knew it. Thomas was too smart to leave something that important where just anyone might stumble across it." His expression quickly sobered. "We need to go, though. My diversion won't keep them occupied for long." "What did you do?" Vivian asked as she grabbed a few additional items from her trunk: a small portrait of her parents, an extra set of clothes, the letters from Thomas. "Let's just say Mayor Harmon's prize stallion is now running free somewhere on the prairie, and his stable is having an unexpected problem with fire." Isaac checked the street through a gap in the curtains. Nothing that will cause lasting damage, but enough to keep his men scrambling for a while. They exited through the cellar, carefully replacing the crates to conceal the door before making their way back to where Vivian had left her horse. Isaac's mount was tethered nearby, skittish but unharmed. As they prepared to leave, Vivian cast a final glance at the building that had been her home and livelihood for the past 2 years. Despite everything, she felt a pang of loss at abandoning it. "We can come back someday," Isaac said quietly, reading her thoughts. "When this is over." Vivian nodded, though she wondered if that would ever truly be possible. Fort Laramie held too many memories, both good and painful. Perhaps a fresh start elsewhere would be better. They rode out along the creek bed, keeping to the lowest ground to avoid being silhouetted against the horizon. The Millerson place lay 3 miles east, a journey that would take them less than half an hour if they encountered no obstacles. But as they crested a small rise about a mile from town, Isaac suddenly reined in sharply, signaling for Vivian to do the same. Ahead of them, on the trail leading to the abandoned homestead, were 3 riders moving at a deliberate pace, clearly searching for something or someone. "Harmon's men," Isaac murmured, his expression grim. "They've guessed our meeting point." Vivian's heart sank. "How? We were so careful." "Someone must have talked, maybe old Millerson himself. He's been known to sell information for whiskey money." Isaac surveyed the surrounding terrain, considering their options. "We can't go forward, and going back to town is too risky." "What about north?" Vivian suggested. "We could circle wide and get back on the trail to Montana." Isaac shook his head. "They'll have men watching the northern routes expecting exactly that." He pointed southeast. "Our best chance is to head for Cheyenne now. It's a hard 2-day ride, but the territorial marshal is there. With the evidence you've recovered, we can end this once and for all." The decision was made in an instant, born of necessity rather than choice. They turned their horses southeast, away from their planned route, and pushed forward at a pace that balanced speed with the need to conserve their mount's strength for the long journey ahead. As they rode, Vivian clutched the hidden papers against her chest, feeling the weight of responsibility they represented. Thomas had died for this evidence. Isaac had been imprisoned, and she had nearly been forced into marriage. So many lives altered by the corruption these documents revealed. Now, finally, there was a chance for justice, a chance for closure, and perhaps, though she hardly dared acknowledge it even to herself, a chance for a new beginning, one that might include the quiet, determined man riding beside her. The road to Cheyenne stretched before them, an uncertain path leading toward an equally uncertain future. But for the first time in years, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than peril. And that, Vivian decided as they rode south under the vast Wyoming sky, was something worth fighting for. The journey to Cheyenne was arduous, taking them across open country where concealment was scarce. They pushed their horses as much as they dared during daylight, then continued by moonlight when the terrain allowed, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the animals and themselves. By dawn of the second day, both Vivian and Isaac were exhausted, saddle sore, and hyper-alert to any sign of pursuit. They had spotted distant riders twice during their flight, but each time had managed to find cover before being seen. "We're less than 10 miles from Cheyenne," Isaac said as they shared the last of their water during a brief stop in the shelter of a rocky outcropping. "We should reach it by midday." Vivian nodded, too tired for conversation. The papers from Thomas's journal were still secure inside her jacket, occasionally crinkling when she moved, a constant reminder of their purpose. "When we get there," Isaac continued, his voice low and serious, "we go directly to the marshal's office. No stops, no detours. Harmon will have telegraphed ahead to his contacts in town, so we can't risk being seen before we've handed over the evidence." "And after?" Vivian asked, the question that had hovered between them for days finally spoken aloud. Isaac met her gaze, something unguarded in his expression for the first time since they'd met. "After is for you to decide, Vivian. I meant what I said about Montana. My cousin's offer stands whether I'm there or not." "And where will you be?" She held her breath, waiting for his answer. "Wherever I'm needed," he replied simply. "I made a promise to Thomas to see this through to make sure you were safe. Once that's done." He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Vivian wanted to press him further, to demand the clarity she craved, but movement on the horizon caught her attention. "Riders," she whispered, pointing southwest. "3 of them coming fast." Isaac sprang to his feet, spyglass already in hand. "Harmon's men," he confirmed after a brief observation. "They must have guessed our destination. Can we outrun them?" Vivian was already moving toward their horses, calculating the remaining distance to Cheyenne. "Not on these mounts, not after the pace we've kept." Isaac's mind was clearly working rapidly, considering and discarding options. "But we might be able to outfox them." He quickly outlined a plan they would separate, with Vivian taking the more direct route to Cheyenne while Isaac created a false trail to draw off their pursuers. It was risky, but it offered their best chance of getting the evidence safely to the marshal. "I don't like the idea of leaving you to face them alone," Vivian protested, even as she recognized the logic of the strategy. "I'm not planning to face them if I can help it," Isaac assured her. "Just lead them on a merry chase while you get those papers to safety." He handed her his more detailed map of Cheyenne, pointing out the location of the marshal's office. "Marshal Everett is a fair man. Tell him everything. Show him the evidence. He'll know what to do." Time was running short. The riders were still distant, but closing steadily. With reluctance born of necessity, Vivian mounted her mare, the protest she wanted to make dying on her lips, as she recognized the determination in Isaac's stance. "Isaac," she said instead, struggling to find the right words for a moment that might be their last. "I thank you for everything." He stepped closer, one hand resting briefly on her knee. "Go safely, Vivian. I'll find you when I can." It wasn't a goodbye, she told herself as she rode away, leaving Isaac to implement his diversion. It was a promise one she would hold him to when this was over. The remaining ride to Cheyenne was a blur of dust and anxiety, her focus narrowed to the singular goal of reaching the marshal's office. The city appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its buildings shimmering in the midday heat. Cheyenne in 1874 was a rapidly growing railroad town, its streets busier and more cosmopolitan than the frontier settlement of Fort Laramie. Vivian kept her head down as she rode through the outskirts, avoiding eye contact with passers-by, her hand never straying far from the revolver concealed in her jacket. The marshal's office was located on a side street near the center of town. a modest brick building with the territorial flag flying alongside the stars and stripes. Vivian dismounted across the street, tethering her exhausted mare to a hitching post before gathering her courage for what came next. As she crossed the dusty road, she became acutely aware of her appearance: trail-worn clothes, hair escaping from its pins, the grime of 2 days' hard riding evident on her face and hands. But there was no time for vanity or social niceties. The evidence she carried was too important for delay. A bell jangled as she pushed open the door to the marshal's office. Inside, a young deputy looked up from his desk, surprise registering on his face at the sight of a disheveled woman entering his domain. "Madam, can I help you?" he asked, rising to his feet with a mixture of confusion and concern. "I need to speak with Marshal Everett immediately," Vivian replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's a matter of life and death." The deputy hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond to such a dramatic declaration from a bedraggled stranger. "The marshal's in a meeting, madam." "Perhaps if you could come back later." "This can't wait," Vivian interrupted, her patience worn thin by exhaustion and anxiety. "Please tell him that Vivian Porter is here with evidence regarding Mayor Harmon of Fort Laramie and the murder of Thomas Porter 2 years ago." The name Harmon clearly registered with the young man. His eyes widened slightly before he nodded and disappeared through a door at the back of the office. Moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard emerged, studying Vivian with keen blue eyes. "Mrs. Porter?" he asked, his voice deep and measured. "I'm Marshal Everett. My deputy says you have information about Calvin Harmon." "I do, sir." Vivian glanced around the office, noting another man watching from a doorway. "But it's a private matter." The marshal seemed to consider this, then nodded. "My office, then." He gestured for her to follow him into a modest room furnished with a desk, several chairs, and shelves lined with law books and territorial records. Once the door was closed, Vivian withdrew the papers from inside her jacket and placed them on the desk. "These are records kept by my husband, Thomas Porter, before his death 2 years ago. They document illegal activities by Mayor Harmon and his associates across several territories." Marshal Everett raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he began to examine the documents with methodical care. Minutes passed in silence as he read, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Where did you get these, Mrs. Porter?" he finally asked, looking up from the damning evidence. Vivian explained everything: Thomas's death, her life in Fort Laramie, Harmon's attempt to force her into marriage, Isaac's timely intervention, and their discovery of the hidden journal. The marshal listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making brief notes. "And this man, Ironwood," Everett said when she had finished. "Where is he now?" The question sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Vivian. "Creating a diversion to draw off Harmon's men who were pursuing us. He should be making his way to Cheyenne if all went according to plan." The marshal's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. "These are serious allegations against prominent men, Mrs. Porter. Acting on them will create significant political waves." "I understand that, sir," Vivian replied, lifting her chin. "But my husband was murdered for discovering this corruption. I was nearly forced into marriage to cover it up. How many others have suffered because these men believe themselves above the law?" A ghost of a smile touched the marshal's weathered face. "I didn't say I wouldn't act on them, Mrs. Porter, only that doing so will stir up a hornet's nest." He gathered the papers into a neat stack. "These will need to be secured immediately, and you'll need protection until we can make arrests." Relief washed over Vivian, so profound she felt momentarily lightheaded. "Thank you, Marshal." Everett rose from his desk and opened a small wall safe, placing the documents inside before locking it securely. "I'll arrange for you to stay somewhere safe tonight. Tomorrow, I'll need you to make a formal statement, and then we'll discuss next steps." "What about Isaac?" Vivian asked, unable to hide her concern. "If he makes it to Cheyenne, I'll have my deputies watch for him," the marshal assured her. "If he arrives, we'll make sure he's brought safely to you." True to his word, Marshal Everett arranged for Vivian to stay in rooms above the milliner's shop owned by his wife, a kindly woman named Margaret who provided a hot bath, clean clothes, and a proper meal without asking questions her husband hadn't already answered. That night, as Vivian lay in a real bed for the first time in days, she found sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. Her thoughts kept returning to Isaac, wondering if he had evaded Harmon's men, if he was safe, if he was perhaps even now making his way to Cheyenne. And beneath those immediate concerns lay deeper questions about the future. What would happen once this was over? Where would she go? What would she do? The dressmaking shop in Fort Laramie no longer felt like home, yet the idea of starting over somewhere new was daunting. Then there was Isaac himself, the man who had risked everything to help her, who had honored a promise to a dead friend beyond all reasonable obligation. What did she feel for him? Gratitude, certainly. Respect, without question. But there was something else taking root, something that made her heart beat faster when she thought of his rare smile, his quiet strength, the gentle way his hand had rested on her knee in that final moment before they parted. Morning brought no answers to these questions, only the practical matters of making her formal statement to Marshal Everett and his deputy. For hours, she recounted every detail she could remember of Thomas's work, Harmon's activities in Fort Laramie, and the events of the past week. By mid-afternoon, warrants had been issued for the arrest of Mayor Calvin Harmon and 5 of his associates on charges ranging from fraud and racketeering to murder. Telegrams were dispatched to law enforcement officials throughout the territory, setting in motion what promised to be one of the largest criminal prosecutions in Wyoming's short history. But still no word of Isaac. As dusk approached, Vivian sat by the window in Mrs. Everett's parlor, watching the street below for any sign of a tall, lean cowboy with eyes the color of the Wyoming sky. The milliner had closed her shop for the day and was busy in the kitchen preparing supper, leaving Vivian alone with her increasingly anxious thoughts. A knock at the street door startled her from her vigil. Mrs. Everett emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron as she went to answer it. Vivian heard low voices in conversation, then footsteps on the stairs leading up to the apartment. Hope and fear warred within her as she rose to her feet, facing the parlor door just as it opened to reveal Marshal Everett and behind him, looking trail-worn and weary but very much alive, Isaac Ironwood. "Look what the wind blew in," the marshal said with a hint of amusement. "Found him asking after you at my office about an hour ago." Vivian stood frozen, unable to move or speak as relief and joy overwhelmed her. Isaac seemed similarly affected, his usual composure momentarily abandoned as his gaze locked with hers across the room. Marshal Everett glanced between them, then cleared his throat. "I'll just go help Margaret with supper. Take your time." He withdrew, closing the door behind him with pointed deliberation. The moment they were alone, Vivian found her voice and her ability to move. "You made it," she said simply, crossing the room to stand before him. Isaac's face relaxed into the rarest of expressions, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his features from handsome to breathtaking. "I told you I would." Harmon's men led them on a wild chase through half the territory before losing them in a box canyon near the Laramie River, Isaac explained. "Took me longer to double back than I'd planned." Without thinking, Vivian reached out to touch his arm, needing the physical confirmation that he was really there, safe and whole. I was worried. So was I, he admitted, his voice dropping lower. About you. Until I heard in town that the marshal had issued warrants for Harmon and his gang based on evidence provided by a courageous woman from Fort Laramie. Vivian felt her cheeks warm at the praise. Marshal Everett was convinced by Thomas's records. The arrests should be happening as we speak. Isaac nodded, his expression sobering. It's finally over then. Thomas can rest in peace. Yes, Vivian agreed softly. Thanks to you. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Isaac was the first to break it, his voice carefully neutral. The marshal tells me you'll need to stay in Cheyenne for the trial. It could be months. That's what he said, Vivian confirmed. And you, will you continue to Montana as planned? Isaac hesitated, his eyes searching hers. That depends. On what? Her heart was beating so loudly she was certain he must hear it. On whether there's a reason for me to stay. The simplicity of his statement belied the complexity of what he was really asking. Vivian took a deep breath, gathering her courage for what might be the most important words she would ever speak. When Thomas died, I thought that part of my life, the part capable of caring deeply for someone, had died with him. She began slowly. I built walls around my heart, focused on simply surviving each day. Then you arrived with your impossible story about being my husband, and everything changed. Isaac remained silent, but his gaze never left her face, his expression intent and hopeful. These past days with you have awakened something I thought was gone forever, Vivian continued. Not just the ability to trust or to hope, but to feel. To feel something I'm not certain I have the right to feel so soon after finding the truth about Thomas's death. Vivian, Isaac said gently, taking her hands in his. Thomas loved you more than anything in this world. His last words to me were about you making sure you would be safe, yes, but also that you would find happiness again someday. Tears blurred her vision at this revelation. He said that. Isaac nodded. He made me promise not just to protect you, but to make sure you knew that he wanted you to live fully, to love again if that became possible. His voice roughened with emotion. What I didn't tell him, what I couldn't tell a dying man who loved his wife so completely, was that I'd already begun to care for you through his stories, through the way his face lit up when he spoke your name. Vivian stared at him in astonishment. You had feelings for me before we even met. Not feelings exactly, Isaac clarified. More like an awareness, a recognition that if I ever met a woman like the one Thomas described, she would be worth knowing, worth caring for. He released one of her hands to gently brush a tear from her cheek. Then I walked into your shop last spring with that torn shirt, and I understood what Thomas had tried to tell me. You were exactly as he had described and so much more. Why didn't you say anything then? Vivian asked, leaning slightly into his touch. It wasn't the right time. You were still grieving, still finding your way forward, and I had no right to intrude on that process. Isaac's gaze dropped briefly. I told myself I would check on you from time to time, make sure you were safe as I'd promised Thomas, nothing more. But then Harmon happened, Vivian supplied, understanding dawning. Isaac nodded. When I heard what he was planning, I knew I couldn't stand by and watch, not just because of my promise to Thomas, but because. He hesitated, then finished in a near whisper, because in that moment I realized my feelings had grown far beyond what was appropriate for my friend's widow. The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Vivian felt as if she stood on the edge of a precipice, with the past behind her and an unknown future ahead. The choice was hers alone to make. Isaac, she said softly, meeting his gaze directly. I don't know what the future holds. The trial, rebuilding my life, finding a new path forward, it's all uncertain. But I do know that I want you to be part of that future, whatever shape it takes. The hope that blazed in his eyes was answer enough, but his words confirmed it. There's nothing I want more, Vivian. If you'll have me not as a pretend husband this time, but as a man who cares for you deeply and wants to build something real together, I'll stay by your side for as long as you wish. It wasn't a declaration of undying love or a formal proposal. Those would come later, when the time was right. But in that moment, in the quiet parlor above a milliner's shop in Cheyenne, it was exactly what Vivian needed to hear. "Then stay," she said simply, and moved into the circle of his arms for the first time, not out of necessity or fear, but out of choice and hope and the promise of something beautiful yet to come. Isaac's embrace was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Then, as she leaned into him, his arms tightened around her, solid and secure. When their lips finally met, it was a kiss of beginnings rather than endings, sweet with the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. The trial of Calvin Harmon and his associates became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Wyoming Territory's history. For 3 months, the territorial court in Cheyenne heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, including Vivian, who spoke with quiet dignity about her husband's discovery of the corruption and his subsequent murder. Isaac, too, testified, describing what he had witnessed the night Thomas died and the imprisonment that had followed his attempts to investigate. His straightforward account of the torture he had endured in the prison camp near Santa Fe left many in the courtroom visibly moved and added weight to the prosecution's case. Throughout the trial, Vivian and Isaac remained in Cheyenne, gradually building a life together even as they helped bring justice to those who had threatened to destroy it. They rented small rooms near the courthouse, took meals together, and in the evenings often walked arm in arm through the growing city, discussing plans for their future with increasing certainty. When the verdict finally came guilty on all counts for Harmon and most of his associates, it felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The corrupt mayor was sentenced to hang for the murder of Thomas Porter and 2 other men who had crossed him over the years. His accomplices received lengthy prison terms for their various crimes. "It's really over," Vivian said as they left the courthouse after the sentencing. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the promise of winter, but she felt only warmth as Isaac's hand held hers. "Justice for Thomas at last," he agreed, his expression solemn but satisfied. "He would be proud of you, Vivian. Your courage made this possible." "Our courage," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have done it without you." They walked in companionable silence for a while, each lost in private thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It was Isaac who eventually broke the silence, his voice carefully casual. "I received a letter from Martin yesterday." "My cousin in Montana," he clarified, though Vivian remembered well. "He says the ranch is doing well, expanding even. He's offered me a partnership if I'm interested." Vivian's heart quickened at the implicit question beneath his words. "Are you interested, I mean?" Isaac stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "That depends entirely on you, Vivian. On me. Montana is still frontier country in many ways," he explained. "Harsher winters than Wyoming, more isolated. The ranch is 20 miles from the nearest town. It would be a very different life from what you knew in Fort Laramie." Vivian considered this, trying to imagine herself in such a setting. Would there be a place for me there? Something meaningful to do beyond being just an attachment to you? Isaac's smile was warm with understanding. "Martin mentioned that the nearest seamstress is in the town. meaning folks from outlying ranches have to travel for clothing repairs and new garments. Someone with your skills could build a thriving business serving the ranch communities. The possibility lit a spark of excitement in Vivian. She had enjoyed her dressmaking work in Fort Laramie, finding satisfaction in creating practical yet beautiful garments for her customers. The idea of establishing a new business, perhaps eventually training apprentices of her own, was appealing. And us? She asked softly, the most important question of all. What would we be to each other in Montana? Isaac took both her hands in his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. Whatever you want us to be, Vivian. Friends, partners, or... He hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. Or husband and wife, in truth this time, not pretense. I love you. I think I have since that first day in your shop, though I was too honor-bound to admit it even to myself. The declaration, though not entirely unexpected after months of growing closeness, still took her breath away. Isaac, you don't need to answer now, he added quickly. I know it's still. Vivian silenced him by rising on tiptoes to press her lips to his, a brief, sweet kiss that conveyed what words could not. When she drew back, his eyes were wide with surprise and dawning joy. I love you too, she said simply. I wasn't looking for love again, thought. Perhaps I didn't deserve it after failing to see what Thomas was facing. But you showed me that loving again doesn't dishonor what we had. It honors it. Isaac's arms encircled her, drawing her close as passers-by smiled indulgently at the couple's evident happiness. Is that a yes to Montana, then? He murmured against her hair. It's a yes to everything, Vivian replied, her heart fuller than she had believed possible after the tragedy that had marked her life 2 years before. Montana, partnership, marriage, all of it. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Cheyenne's small church, with Marshall Everett giving the bride away and Mrs. Everett arranging a modest reception afterward. The following day, they departed for Montana Territory, traveling by train as far as the rails would take them, then by wagon for the final leg of the journey. Martin Ironwood's ranch, the Broken Arrow, sprawled across a verdant valley nestled against the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. The main house was larger than Vivian had expected, a sturdy 2-story structure built of logs and local stone, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several outbuildings, corrals, and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands completed the settlement. Martin himself proved to be an older, more weathered version of Isaac, with the same direct gaze and quiet competence. A widower in his 50s, he welcomed Vivian with genuine warmth, treating her from the first moment as family rather than a stranger. Isaac wrote so much about you that I feel I know you already, he told her as he showed them to the comfortable rooms that would be theirs, until they could build their own cabin on land adjacent to the main ranch. Any woman who could stand up to Calvin Harmon and live to tell about it is welcome at my table. The transition to ranch life was not without challenges. The Montana winters were indeed harsher than those Vivian had known in Wyoming, and the isolation took some adjustment after the relative sociability of Fort Laramie. But there were compensations that far outweighed the difficulties. The beauty of the landscape, for one, sweeping vistas of mountains and prairie, skies so vast and clear that stars seemed close enough to touch on clear nights. The satisfaction of building something new, as Isaac's partnership with his cousin expanded the ranch's operations and Vivian's sewing business gradually grew from occasional repairs for neighboring ranchers to commissioned garments for their wives and children. And most of all, the deep, abiding contentment of a marriage built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a love that had been forged in adversity and grew stronger with each passing day. By the spring of 1876, they had completed their own home, a comfortable cabin with large windows to capture the mountain views, and a special room designed specifically for Vivian's sewing work. That same spring brought the news that Vivian was expecting their first child, a development that filled Isaac with equal parts terror and delight. "What if I'm not good at this?" he confessed one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. His hand rested protectively on the gentle swell of Vivian's belly. "I never had much example of fatherhood growing up." "You'll learn," Vivian assured him, covering his hand with her own. "We both will. And you have so much love to give, Isaac. I see it every day in how you care for everyone around you, Martin, the ranch hands, the animals, me. That's what a child needs most." He seemed comforted by this, and as the months passed, his excitement gradually overcame his apprehension. He built a cradle with his own hands, carefully sanding each surface until it was satin smooth. Martin contributed a rocking chair that had been his wife's, and neighbors from surrounding ranches organized a baby shower that left Vivian overwhelmed with handmade blankets, tiny garments, and practical advice from women who had raised children in frontier conditions. Their son, Thomas Martin Ironwood, was born on a crisp autumn morning with the first snowflakes of the season drifting past the windows. He had Isaac's eyes and Vivian's determined chin, a combination that both parents agreed would likely make for a formidable personality once he was old enough to express it. Holding his son for the first time, Isaac wept unashamedly, overcome by emotions he couldn't have imagined before Vivian entered his life. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing his forehead to hers as the infant slept peacefully between them. "For this, for everything." Vivian understood what he meant. For second chances, for new beginnings, for the family they were building together one day at a time. 3 years later, a daughter joined their family, Eleanor Vivian Ironwood, named for Isaac's mother and her own. By then, the Broken Arrow had become one of the most successful ranching operations in the territory, and Vivian's dressmaking business had expanded to include 2 young apprentices from neighboring homesteads. Life was not without its challenges: harsh winters, occasional disputes with cattle rustlers, the ongoing struggles of frontier existence, but these were faced together, with the resilience and determination that had brought them through their early trials. On the 5th anniversary of their arrival in Montana, Vivian and Isaac stood on the hill behind their home, watching their children play in the spring wildflowers that carpeted the meadow below. Thomas, now 4, was attempting to teach his toddling sister how to make a daisy chain, with limited success but abundant patience. "You ever regret it?" Isaac asked, his arm around Vivian's waist. "Leaving Wyoming, starting over here?" Vivian leaned into his embrace, considering the question seriously as she always did. "Not for a moment," she finally answered. "Everything that happened, even the painful parts, led us here, to this life, these children." She turned in his arms to face him directly. "I wouldn't change a single step of the journey." Isaac's kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of all they had built together and all that was yet to come. As they walked back down the hill to join their children, Vivian reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment of contentment. From a young widow facing forced marriage, to a fugitive fleeing across the Wyoming wilderness with a man who claimed to be her husband, to a witness instrumental in bringing down a corrupt official, to a beloved wife and mother building a new life in Montana territory, it was not the future she had envisioned for herself when Thomas Porter had first courted her years ago. Yet here she was, surrounded by love and purpose, her heart full to overflowing with gratitude for second chances and unexpected blessings. Isaac had once told her that life on the frontier was about adapting to whatever came your way, finding strength in adversity, and recognizing the opportunities hidden within challenges. Looking at her family, the tall, steadfast man who had risked everything to save her and now devoted himself to their shared happiness, and the children who represented their hope for the future, Vivian knew that together they had done exactly that. And as the Montana sunset gilded the distant mountains with light, she offered a silent thanks to Thomas for leading Isaac to her door that night, beginning the journey that had brought them all at last home.